White Noise is a dissertation on death. More uniquely, it's a think piece on the fear of death rather than death itself. It explores the universality of this fear and the persistent need for its control, and provides the ultimate solution of belief and acceptance of death. Before I get into my analysis, I want to go through some disclaimers as always. So of course there's going to be spoilers ahead, so stop watching if you don't want to be spoiled on this movie. Also, this is my opinion, my analysis. You might disagree with my analysis. My analysis could be incorrect in some ways, but please just keep it respectful in the comments. Also, I didn't read the book, so I definitely could be missing some pieces or misinterpreting some pieces. So my analysis is only off of what the film presented and what I think the film was trying to portray. That's it for my disclaimers. Now let's get into the discussion. It's clear that the film is tackling the subject of death. Who thinks about it? How we think about it? How much we think about it? Although the main characters may have a more extreme fear of death than the rest of the population, thinking about death is certainly a universal experience. The film is very real in the way that it portrays both the weird and the not-so-weird ways that we all obsess about death. From the more reasonable obsessions, like our daydreams and nightmares of what happens after death, thinking about how our loved ones will react when we die, to trying to hold off death as long as we can by watching what we eat or by avoiding certain unsafe situations, to the more dark yet normal things we do, like rubbernecking. The story surrounds the characters Jack and Babette, who are married to each other and have 4 kids. We watch them navigate their lives, their careers, their families, and we see how integral the idea of death is to their experience. At first, their discussions about death seem relatively normal. One of the first times we see them ponder upon death, they are almost using it as pillow talk. I want to die first so that I don't have to live without you. No, I want to die first so I don't have to live without you.
I want to die first.
You sound almost eager.
Life would feel unbearably sad and lonely without you.
But over time, we see how these once innocent and normal thoughts grow into something darker. One of the main mysteries of the film is what is going on with Babette. We see her take pills, hide the evidence, and deny that she ever took any medication, and Jack and Babette's daughter Denise become worried. The pills themselves are also a mystery, since no one knows anything about the medicine. Denise can't find anything about it in her research. Jack's chemist coworker can't say much about what's in it or what it does, and Babette's psychiatrist says he didn't prescribe it to her. Eventually, probably about 3/4 of the way through the film, we learn that Babette signed up for this sketchy underground clinical trial. That's why she has a medicine that no one knows anything about. Jack eventually gathers up the courage to ask Babette what the medicine is for, and she reveals it's to cure her fear of death. It's not just Babette who has this special fear of death, it's also Jack. And for people who are so afraid of death, it's odd how much they willingly surround themselves with it. For example, Babette teaches a posture class to the elderly. While working with the elderly isn't working with death exactly, it's not working in a hospital or at a crematorium, for example, it is pretty close to that end of the spectrum. You would think someone with Babette's fear would go for a job that is the complete opposite of death, working with kids at an elementary school, for example. Jack's job is where it gets really weird, though. He is an expert in Hitler studies, meaning that he spends all his time researching death incarnate. Another thing that's seemingly contradictory about Jack and Babette is how they tend to deny the fact that they can, and will, die someday. Yes, of course they know about death. They know that death will come knocking on their door one day, but this reflects the reality of how a lot of us are, and that we can't ever imagine that day actually coming. It doesn't seem real until it hits somewhere personal, either a close call or the death of a loved one. One act of the movie revolves around this close call incident with the family. A semi-truck carrying a toxic chemical crashes into a train, causing a big accident and releasing this toxic chemical into the air. The community is immediately concerned about whether this toxic cloud is a risk to the neighborhood. The news is talking about the spill, and the kids are constantly worried about health effects from the chemical and the direction of the plume. When the kids bring up their concerns, Jack and Babette immediately brush them aside, saying, for instance, that the wind never blows in their direction.
They're keeping it from getting bigger. When do we eat?
I don't know. If it gets any bigger, it'll get here with or without a wind.
It won't get here.
How do you know?
Because it won't.
Jack even says at one point that poor and uneducated people are more likely to be affected by these kinds of disasters, as justification for why they, a middle-class, educated family, have nothing to worry about. While it may be true that poor people tend to suffer more from these types of disasters, this isn't a justification for why you shouldn't be worried for yourself and take the necessary precautions. Even when the police drive by the house to announce that an evacuation order is in place, Jack and Babette continue their dinner in peace until the kids break them out of their trance and convince them to evacuate. What's weird about this situation is that for how obsessive Jack and Babette are about death, they don't really do much to prolong their lives. This could be a coping mechanism for Jack and Babette. Maybe if they continue believing that it's impossible the toxic cloud will reach their home, then it will, in fact, never come. Or perhaps it's just a peculiarity with the human psyche. Again, it's very true to human behavior that we do things that we know are bad for us. It's not just Jack and Babette's reaction to the toxic cloud that is contradictory to their immense fear of death, but it's also their other day-to-day behaviors. At one point, Jack remarks that Babette shouldn't be afraid of dying anytime soon, since she works out. This tells us something about Jack, that he believes that he will die sooner because he does not exercise and has put on weight. And although Babette exercises, we learn that she used to smoke, and when Denise brings up the warning label for Babette's chewing gum, she doesn't really care to switch to a healthier alternative.
That stuff causes cancer in laboratory animals, in case you didn't know.
You wanted me to chew sugarless gum, Denise. It was your idea.
You would think that two people so afraid of death would work diligently to prevent death as long as possible. They would take the toxic cloud seriously, Jack would exercise, Babette would never have smoked, and she would care more about the chemicals she puts into her body. And they do care a little bit, and they are at least aware of these faults, but they don't do enough to fix them. Going back to the toxic cloud event, during the family's evacuation, Jack needed to put gas in the car, at which point the toxic cloud engulfed them. At the evacuation camp, they later learned that anyone who is exposed to the cloud for more than 30 seconds is considered contaminated. Jack goes to report himself as contaminated, and there's not much that the workers can do for him. All they do is tell him that they will know more in 15 to 30 years, since they don't know much about the health effects caused by the chemical. Jack receives this almost as a death sentence, that he doesn't have much time left to live. And this news wasn't even a death sentence or a diagnosis, it was more of a wait and see what happens. While this is of course a terrifying experience to undergo, and is a troubling statement to receive, he wasn't given any probabilities of what might happen to him. And 15 to 30 more years isn't terribly different than what Jack would normally live. Assuming Jack is currently 40 years old, this diagnosis would mark his potential death at 55 to 70. Barring any random accidents or illnesses, he would expect to live anywhere between his 60s to 80s. So this diagnosis isn't very different from what he was already expecting. But what this diagnosis does is turn Jack's idea of death from an abstract concept to a tangible reality.
There's something I promised myself I wouldn't tell you. I'm tentatively scheduled to die.
Death is no longer something that will eventually happen to him. It's something that will happen to him. Although Jack would likely live a similar amount of years as Babette, even though he was exposed to this toxic cloud, he believes that this death sentence entitles him to have a greater fear of death than Babette has. Both Jack and Babette are obsessed with the idea of death, and are so paralyzed by their fear of death that finding a cure becomes their obsession. It's an interesting take on the classic journey of finding a cure for death, the idea of the Holy Grail, everlasting life. This is the dream behind many adventurous tales told throughout history. In White Noise, instead of addressing the cause, death, they instead address the symptom, fear of death. They are looking for their own Holy Grail, which in place of preventing death, would instead cure their fear of death. Perhaps their focus on the symptom, fear of death, rather than the cause, death itself, explains their lack of diligence when it comes to preventing death itself in the form of a looming toxic cloud. Jack and Babette are desperate to control their fear of death, and their desperation takes them to extremes in the second half of the film. Babette, as we know, signs up for a sketchy underground clinical trial that is testing a new medicine called Dylar that cures fear of death. Again, this shows a persistence in going after the symptom and not the cause, because signing up for an underground drug that has never before been tested on humans is risky. Dylar could very well shorten Babette's life, but she doesn't seem to care. She only cares whether it relieves her of her fear of death. And she is so desperate to receive this medicine that when the clinical trial falls through, she volunteers her body sexually for the Dylar supplier, Mr. Gray, in exchange for more pills. Jack resorts to other means of controlling his fear. His coworker, Murray, suggests that killing someone may relieve his fear of death. Jack later goes after Mr. Gray and attempts to kill him. What we see is Jack's desire for control. This explains Jack's odd obsession with Hitler. Hitler and the Holocaust are basically synonymous with death, both death and death. Hitler, for all intents and purposes, is death itself. Jack's obsession with Hitler leans almost into a horrified admiration, not because of the atrocities he committed, but because of the control he had over death, and because of the control he had over millions of people's fear of death. This universal, absolute control made him almost a god in Jack's eyes, and it's clear that Jack wants to have a similar kind of control over his own life and death and fear of death, as is brilliantly visualized in this scene, where old video footage of Hitler is projected onto Jack's face, almost putting him in the shoes of Hitler and into his seat of power and control. It's curious why the story centers on dreams of curing fear of death rather than death itself. Maybe after millennia of never finding a cure for death, either magical or scientific, there is no hope left for everlasting life. Maybe the more modern and reasonable hope is to someday to at least be able to cure the fear of death. Anyway, the film doesn't provide a magical cure or a unique, profound answer to this question. What the characters leave with is the importance of acceptance, belief, and hope. This lesson is mostly taught in the end, when Jack and Babette run into an odd convent of nuns who don't believe in heaven. Their conversation emphasizes the importance that religion plays in most people's lives. Religion gives people something to believe in and hope for after death, which helps to alleviate their fears of death. When elaborating on her fear of death, Babette references this fear of marching into non-existence, which, by the way, is where I think the title White Noise comes from. If a TV show is your life, the white noise is the meaningless static or nothingness that comes after. But religion gives people something to believe in other than that white noise after death. And I don't think the film is being explicitly pro-religion. I think it's just emphasizing the importance of belief, of these coping mechanisms we create to make our fates more tolerable. When Jack and Babette are talking to the nun, she leaves them with one piece of advice: believe in each other. And after this experience, we can see the new strength of their bond. When Jack's coworker Murray suggests that killing someone may alleviate a fear of death, he says that there are dyers and there are killers. Basically, that if Jack kills someone, he may hold off death a little bit longer. Later on, when Babette is telling Jack about the Dylar clinical trial, Jack demands to know more about Mr. Gray. Babette doesn't want to tell him because she thinks men are more prone to a jealous rage and that Jack will try and kill him, which is what he eventually tries to do. At the moment, though, the thought of killing Mr. Grey is unthinkable to Jack, and he says that he's not a killer.
No, you have to tell me who he is.
No. How do I know you won't kill him?
Because I'm not a killer.
Later on, he goes to kill Mr. Grey, seemingly to get revenge for what he did to Babette, but really it was to get control over death by becoming a killer, not a dyer. And this is quite literal in the film, as Mr. Grey physically represents death, with a capital D, as this Grim Reaper-like figure that's been haunting Jack's dreams. Jack's attempt to kill Mr. Grey is an attempt to kill death itself. In the end, Jack doesn't go through with killing Mr. Grey, showing his acceptance in being a dyer, not a killer. They end the story by taking a trip to the supermarket. Jack praises hope and all of the mechanisms civilization comes up with to hope. Earlier in the film, Murray says, "Once we stop denying death, we can proceed calmly to die," which is exactly what Jack and Babette attempt to do in the end. Murray had also talked about the supermarket as a place that recharges us spiritually, a transitional place between death and rebirth. In this case, this supermarket trip symbolizes the death of Jack and Babette's old selves and the rebirth of their new selves that choose to believe in something other than white noise. That's it for my analysis of white noise. It's not particularly deep. They say a lot of this in the movie itself, but it's a lot to take in just one viewing, so I thought I'd attempt to organize it and simplify it down a bit. There's definitely a lot more to unpack as well. I feel like I'm pretty much just scratching the surface here, but let me know what you think in the comments below, and I'll see you next time. Bye!